You write about the myth of responsibility, but myths have roles. So what role does responsibility play in our civilization, our society? What do we lose if all of a sudden we confronted the myth of responsibility and realized it was a myth?
This is a question I spend some time on in the book, and I try and pick apart steadily and slowly, because I think there are so many fears and concerns which arise when you begin to question the traditional notion of individual responsibility. And the misunderstandings surrounding the issue are vast, and I understand it. When I first was developing my ideas in this area and researching, I had many concerns too, but if you stick with the idea, if you become more familiar, you begin to see everything that we really value, meaning in life, truth, morality, community, and the desire for maybe a fairer society, a more democratic society, and art, and all the things that make life what it can be, they are unthreatened. In fact, many of those things are enhanced. I think it's a real push in the direction of humility and compassion and empathy when we begin to understand that, we can't just hold the individual completely responsible for the way that they are and the situations they find themselves in. We're pushed to try and understand someone instead of judge them. And I think that can lead to actually a deeper morality, which makes me very hopeful. But we do lose some things, but the things we lose, I think we probably could do, better without. We lose a system which allows those who have great privilege to feel entitled. So it's a lot harder to believe that you deserve your privilege when you understand the key role of luck in our society. It's a lot harder to justify one country or one class or one people controlling a hugely disproportionate amount of wealth and power when you understand that the root of that is ultimately luck. It's not that one particular group or nation or people deserve more than others. No one deserves more than others. We all come into this world with a set of needs, and we're going to exit the world at some point, and in that beautiful brief gap that we call life, we all deserve to have the opportunity to flourish, to love, to be loved, and to do work which we find meaningful and invigorating. Now, that's true across the board. Of course, the opportunities across society don't allow that for many people, and it's just huge inequality and huge injustice, which is justified by this myth. So I'm happy about losing aspects of kind of traditional assumptions in society which follow from the myth. But everything that I consider valuable in life, I think, is either enhanced or maintained while rejecting the notion of individual or responsibility.
You also talk about the empowering nature of realizing that we have no real freedom. But in realizing that we have no real freedom, then we have no real responsibility. So how is the most responsible thing that we can do realizing that we have no responsibility for our actions?
I think it comes down to how we define these words, because language traps us in many ways, because we use the same word to mean very different things in different contexts. So I think we are driven to do good things by our values, by what we think is important, inspiring, and beautiful. I'm drawn towards a world which is fairer. It matters to me that there are people out there starving and that there are people homeless. It's not a belief that I created myself and can take ultimate responsibility for myself that makes me care about the fact that there are children suffering, the fact that we are destroying the environment for future generations. What makes me care about those things are my values. And values are independent of the way we think about responsibility. They come from our culture, from probably our biological history, and the examples that we find in art, in literature, and religion, and in our families and media. And so I want to, in terms of creating a better world, it's focusing on our values and a map of reality which allows us to serve those values in the most effective way. So that's, for me, why the two things are independent. We on the one hand can say that we are not truly responsible for the way we are. We didn't create ourselves. And, this is a very old idea. Although it's not a huge part of our society, and I think there are good reasons, as I've kind of talked about already, why this myth has endured so long, because it's very politically useful. From Darwin to Albert Einstein, to Stephen Hawking, to a whole host of biologists, thinkers, physicists, and philosophers, this idea has been embraced, but it hasn't permeated the mainstream of our culture. And what's interesting, if people are worried about kind of the moral implications of adopting this idea, there have been a number of studies which showed that the stronger our belief in responsibility, the more likely we are actually to blame victims, want harsher punishments for people, and the more likely we are to view the world as it is, as fair and just. So I think if we're worried about moral behavior, we should be worried about the myth of responsibility, because it encourages these kind of punitive attitudes and complacent attitudes which say, yes, there's gross inequality, but that's just because people deserve what they get.
Raoul, one last question for you, Raoul. We've been speaking with Raoul Martinez. He is author of Creating Freedom, The Lottery of Birth, The Illusion of Consent, and the Fight for Our Future. Raoul is a philosopher, artist, and award-winning filmmaker. In fact, his book, Creating Freedom, is also a documentary. One last question for you, Raoul, and it's what we call the question from hell, the question we might hate to ask, you might hate to answer, where our audience is going to hate your response. You point out how the belief that we are ultimately responsible for the choices we make is at the heart of our judicial system, at the heart of the U.S. belief that those who are rich deserve it and those who are poor deserve their fate as well. You argue this incoherent way of thinking makes it far easier to justify inequalities of wealth, power, and opportunity. And you write, a modern secular manifestation of the responsibility myth is found in the promise of the American dream, that anyone can become rich and those who do deserve it, whereas those who don't only have themselves to blame. So, Raoul, is the American myth, or American dream, I already stopped myself, is the American dream not only a myth, but a dangerous myth that leads to inequality?
I do, yeah, I think it is. I think it's a mechanism of control. If you get people to believe that anyone can achieve anything within that society, then what you're essentially asking of people is to accept that you have a just, fair, egalitarian society, one in which it's only the choices of the individual which determine where you end up. So it completely changes the topic and moves our attention away from questions of inequality, questions of distribution, questions of racism, questions of sexism, questions of how the whole society is structured. And instead it encourages us to say, just look at the individual. And in a way, it's a very attractive idea, because it appears superficially to be very empowering. It says, wow, me as an individual, all I have to do is work harder, try harder, and I can achieve anything. And it's, that's an attractive message. But actually, it's not truly empowering. True empowerment comes from knowledge and understanding through shaping our picture of reality so it's actually more accurate. When we have that knowledge, when we have a better map of reality, we have a much better chance at getting to where we want to go. And the truth is, the American dream is a myth. It doesn't exist, and there are people working extremely hard at the bottom of society, 2, 3 jobs, showing incredible courage, incredible endurance, huge character, and they're not rewarded. They have enormously difficult lives, a struggle simply to get the basics of life, to have a mortgage, to have a home, to feed their children, to afford healthcare. So I would have to say that at least now, and I would say for the last few decades, it's been a very dangerous myth, one which needs to be rejected. But it's a dream which is worth fighting for. It's certainly worth fighting for the kind of society in which everyone does have the opportunity to flourish. So I accept it as a dream, but it hasn't been a reality for a long time.